now I am very pleased to welcome to the stage and virtually through the internet our speakers for Earthquake, Raising Our EQ-IQ. The session will be led by our moderator, Malaika Omi, who is a geoscientist with the Geological Survey of Canada and has worked for 20 years on the science policy interface through natural hazard research and its applications. She started her career at the GSC as part of an international development project working with the National Geoscience Agencies of Argentina, Bolivia, Canada, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Venezuela to better connect the Geological Survey organizations with civil defense and land use planning. She has seen geoscience-informed risk reduction in action through the Geological Survey of Canada's Public Safety Geoscience Program as part of a project working to adapt FEMA's HAZUS tool, I'm hoping I'm saying that right, for Canada, applying earthquake risk assessments at the municipal scale, communicating risk to practitioners, scaling up earthquake risk assessment to the national level, and now as the program manager, connecting the program with stakeholders, like all of you. So I am very pleased to welcome you three to the stage, and I will let you take it from there.
Thank you, Caroline, and thanks to everyone in the room for joining us at the end of your day. And I feel sometimes as earthquakes, we compete with the climate-affected hazards. But in Canada, we locate up to about 5,000 earthquakes in Canada every year, about one of which is felt every week. So seismicity is real, just like climate change. And today, I am happy to be able to share some work within government with you, and then we can benefit from the experience of New Zealand and what the New Zealand Earthquake Commission has done via Joe Horrocks, who we have online. Thanks, Joe. So if we can go to my slides, please. Oh, great. Thank you. So at the Geological Survey of Canada and our sister organization, the Canadian Hazards Information Service, we're the government stable of geoscientists, geologists, geophysicists, seismologists, and so we work across geohazards. And the program I manage looks at earthquakes, terrestrial and marine landslides, volcanoes, tsunamis, coastal flooding, and our sister program looks at other climate-affected hazards as well. So as mentioned, and likely I'm speaking to a well-informed room, we have the seismicity in Canada broadly is in the west, as well as some in the Arctic, and then the Ottawa-St. Lawrence corridor. And that means that about 40% of Canadians are in medium and high hazard zones. And what I'm going to share today is the work we've done in taking the seismic hazard model, which is public data with published methodology, and layered that with also an open source exposure model, and created a public earthquake risk model. And I'm happy to have heard yesterday from Olivier Gay and Linda McCrandle the importance of public models and open and transparent data. And I want to acknowledge too that this work, I am representing it. However, it's largely Tegan's baby as our scientific lead, and we have a great team behind us. So I'm also going to breeze through it because Tegan presented this last year, and so I just wanted to bring it to the attention of folks who didn't see that, and encourage you to reach out if this is of interest to your teams. So as mentioned, we've taken the hazard. We have our own in-house exposure model with all open public data. We created a social vulnerability model that looks at various aspects of the factors that make people and communities vulnerable, such as housing autonomy, demographics, financial agency. And then we built a building portfolio largely aligned with the HAZUS taxonomies and occupancy classes, as what you see here. And our model allows you to see what buildings are driving earthquake risk within that. So we bring that all together with our partners at the Global Earthquake Model Foundation. So we're using global best practices and a global open source model through the Global Earthquake Model Foundation. It's called OpenQuake, and that's allowed us to create a probabilistic and a deterministic model that reports on the indicators you see there. So building damage, economic loss, injuries, disruption, and debris generation. And we do that, again, in two ways, looking at scenarios and probabilistically. And I think I'm speaking to a room where I don't need to break out what those mean. So again, the indicators that we report on. And what that's allowed us to do is look at, and again, I should have explained too, this is for ground shaking only. So we look to build in secondary perils as we move forward, and indirect costs as well. But for direct ground shaking, we've been able, through the modeling, to look at the average annual loss for Canada and the 500-year loss. And so that's what I'm showing here. So again, and then breaking down by province. So we've got on the left the absolute loss, where you can see BC and Quebec driving that. But then when you normalize it, and so related to assets at risk and vulnerability, then you get the Yukon and New Brunswick creeping up, and Quebec a little bit decreased. So we also see through this model that a handful of communities have disproportionate risk. And what is underappreciated is that the highest municipality for absolute losses is Montreal. When you combine the municipalities around the Metro Vancouver area, those do rise higher than Montreal, but we hope that through a public model like this, we can work with people like you to raise awareness of that risk in Eastern Canada, where the insurance take-up is so poor, and yet where there is significant risk. What we also see through our modeling is the real vulnerability of remote and rural Indigenous communities in Western Canada, and some of them coastal as well. Our model allows us to break out also which buildings are driving that loss. So because in Canada we have a lot of wood building stock, that's what shows the highest annual financial loss. But in terms of total assets exposed, it's concrete and unreinforced masonry that have the highest fatalities. So we're sharing all of this on riskprofiler.ca, and we'd be happy to meet with any of you and your teams to share more. So please reach out if that's something of interest. And to give a little highlight, you can see at the top here, you can look at scenarios or probabilistic. So here we're selecting a scenario. We can see expected ground shaking. And then you can select a variety of indicators to see what that scenario might result in. And that is further broken down by building type, design level, and code level. And all the data is downloadable via the three little hash marks above the graph, to the top right of the graph. And you can zoom in for further resolution too. This is not at the building level, it's aggregated to the neighborhood level. And there's a retrofit toggle as well. So you can see and compare what you might expect in cost benefit should you retrofit that entire portfolio of buildings. Looking at probabilistic risks as well, you can select from a variety of indicators, and I'm just showing the top few here, and then zoom in by municipality, or search by municipality, or zoom in right to the neighborhood level at the finest granularity. And this allows for an apples-to-apples comparison across the country. So you can look at total losses at the municipal level, or you can zoom in for more granularity as well at the neighborhood level. and at the postal code level. And at the postal code level too, you can see loss exceedance curves for a given municipality. So showing the 5% mean and 95%. So as mentioned, this is ground shaking only, and moving forward, we'd like to build on this model and hope to be the public model that can support broader public awareness and a communication tool for all of us. So as mentioned, we're happy to work with anyone, and please reach out if this is something that is of any interest to your team. We originally did this with the kind of key stakeholders of emergency managers and planners in mind, but have learned the potential value as a communication tool with the financial sector. So want to work to answer questions that we can there too. So those are where we're going, but I want to hand it over now to Henry Sayward, Program Manager at the Canadian Hazards Information Service and for Earthquake Early Warning. Thanks.
Good afternoon, thank you. So I'm going to be talking a bit about the Canadian National Earthquake Early Warning System, which will be going operational later this year. Wrong way. Earthquake risk in Canada, I think Malika's already given us a good introduction there. There's mitigation through building codes, but that is a kind of diminishing returns kind of thing now. Whereas earthquake early warning can provide a new mechanism to avoid losses from a major earthquake. Earthquake early warning has been operational in other countries for many years, in Japan since the 1960s, and most importantly for us in the United States since about 5 years. The system works by detecting earthquake P waves, there we go, which move rapidly through the earth without causing much damage. Detecting those P waves allows us to determine whether there is an earthquake of significance and the areas that it might expect. Oops, sorry. And allows us to calculate how big that earthquake is and where it might be, and then to distribute a warning to citizens and to critical infrastructure operators and allow protective actions to be taken, and that can reduce costs and prevent injuries and deaths. The biggest piece of the earthquake early warning system is the deployment of new sensor networks. This involves installing over 400 sensors in British Columbia, Eastern Ontario, and Southern Quebec, and that's our network. Some of these are in extremely remote locations. If you want to capture an earthquake coming in from offshore, for example, in British Columbia, you need to be able to capture them coming in as they cross the land interface, and then make those measurements, and then you transmit the data back to data centers using high-speed communications, such as internet and cellular modems and satellite communication. A critical factor in the system is cross-border interoperability with our American colleagues. We share the same software package that was developed initially for California, but now operational in Washington and Oregon as well. And we share data so that earthquakes in the United States can be processed and detected in our system, and vice versa, earthquakes in Canada will be detected and used for the creation of warnings in the United States. To process this data, so these 400 sensors send their information back to 2 data centers. The critical thing is to avoid downtime should one of those data centers become non-operational, either through natural factors or through planned downtime and so on. Earthquake early warnings are then distributed from the data centers to the public using the National Public Alerting System, NPAS. Typically these messages appear on phones. And then also we are able to distribute warnings to subscribed technical partners who may use those warnings to take various protective actions to protect facilities and equipment and so on. These are the earthquake early warning coverage regions. This shows areas, the idea is that we want to cover areas with moderate to high earthquake risk. And our maps here show the expected frequency of public alerts in particular time periods. So you can see that the major areas of concern for for warning rates are the far west coast of British Columbia, and then centered around the Charlevoix, Quebec City areas in Quebec. So the system tends to is able to detect those earthquakes, and then we cover areas where there's also significant population concentrations or significant critical infrastructure that we feel we need to protect. So this is a scenario, potential earthquake performance based on an earthquake that actually happened, 1946 magnitude 7.3 Vancouver Island earthquake, and this shows the expected warning times that the system would be able to deliver. So roughly 40 seconds for Vancouver, 50 seconds for Victoria. One thing to note is that very close to the earthquake center, there won't be any warning. You can't really, there's no time for that SP wave delay to allow warnings very close to the earthquake. Similarly, an earthquake in southern Quebec, based on the more recent Saguenay earthquake, 5.9 in 1988, we would be able, for an earthquake like that, to do provide almost 30 seconds of warning for for Quebec City, and almost a minute and a half for Montreal. So at what level do we alert at? So alert thresholds are based on the predicted magnitude and the predicted intensity of shaking. So we only intend to alert for potentially significant and harmful earthquakes. We don't want to be waking people up in the middle of the night just to tell them that an earthquake has happened. So the public alerts will be distributed for events that have a magnitude of at least 5 and affect an area with an intensive shaking of greater than or equal to 4 within some particular area. So as I said, it uses the National Public Alerting System. Is currently in operation for severe weather alerts, for Amber alerts, and so on. And the distribution is through radio and television and cell phones. The alerting to technical partners, that is to critical infrastructure operators, these alerts are sent to people who subscribed, and we send those alerts out at a lower level of shaking with the expectation that the facility owner has an understanding of what types of actions they may wish to take depending on the sensitivity of their equipment. For example, a chip fab may have a very low tolerance for shaking, and they may want to do something at a low level. Trains probably a little bit higher. The messages that we send to our technical partners include the location and magnitude of the event, and then an indication of peak ground, of MMI, and then peak ground velocity, peak ground acceleration. So there's various steps for which it goes through. Some of the potential use cases for technical partner early warning would be automated stopping of trains, particularly for urban transport trains. You want to stop those, and even if you can't fully stop them before the earthquake hits, a slowed train has much less likelihood of jumping the tracks than a stopped one. Sending alarms to hospitals where doctors can stop their surgeries. It's very easy to move away from your patient for a few seconds while the earthquake comes through, and potentially resume or potentially take other actions afterwards. Opening doors on fire halls, for example, or if that can be done before the earthquake happens, even a moderate amount of shaking can jam a door. Your fire trucks do no good if they can't get out of their buildings. So with an earthquake early warning system, there's a greater potential for being able to respond after the earthquake. Divert aircraft from landing. If you let people know that an earthquake is coming through the airport, tell the pilot to abort his landing. You're not landing on a moving runway. Stop traffic on bridges and tunnels. Stopping elevators helps avoid people being trapped in elevator shafts. Securing cranes and docks and other heavy industrial equipment or other potential applications. closing valves, parking hard drives in data centers. I don't actually know if people use really hard drives anymore. Everything seems to have gone solid state, but I think it's a potential use case anyway. Preparing generators for use, so there's continuous power if there's a failure. So in summary, the earthquake early warning system will provide seconds to tens of seconds of warning prior to a major earthquake, which could reduce the impact of these earthquakes to Canadians. We anticipate the system will be going live in British Columbia in April. So we're quite busy right now making sure that it's ready to go. And then in Quebec and Ontario in the fall of this year. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, great. Well, it's hard to go on the heels of that. My name is Tegan. I'm a research scientist at the Geological Survey of Canada and the lead scientist for the National Seismic Risk Model that Malaika already did a great job of outlining. So what I'm going to be talking about instead is a different project where we're trying to create a rapid earthquake damage assessment tool where we leverage our existing national risk model for more of a short-term response functionality. And I'll just also highlight that I'm presenting on behalf of a lot of work that was done by my student, Megumi Patchett. So the idea with this rapid earthquake damage estimation, or READY as we're calling it, the motivation for it is that we know that there's a very large drop-off in survivability for people who are trapped in damaged buildings after about 1 to 2 days. We also know, however, that situational awareness in that critical time is expected to be incredibly low in Canada. And we know that it's probably going to be low for quite a long time. Some work that my student has done here, she conducted a series of informational interviews with first responders, emergency managers, critical infrastructure operators across Canada and at different levels of government and engaging with Indigenous communities. And when asked how long they think it'll take to gain credible situational awareness about a major earthquake, the majority of respondents said it would take at least 3 days and probably weeks. And when we asked them how they're planning to gain this situational awareness, it was a lot of tools that we know are not going to be very quick or may not even be operational. For example, we know that 911 lines tend to get overwhelmed with even very small earthquakes that don't cause any damage, so we don't expect that to be a useful source of information. A lot of folks also talked about conducting windshield assessments, which we know are fairly incomplete and will probably tend to bias towards the less damaged areas where roadways and walkways are still, you can move yourself along them. So with this in mind, we started to think, okay, well, yeah, what can we do with the tools we already have? So our goal is to use the Canadian Seismic Risk Model, Canada SRM, with the Earthquake Early Warning Network that Henry just did such a great job of outlining that's going to be going live later this year. So if we take the shake map or shaking information from the Earthquake Early Warning Network, we can have some sense of what the expected intensity of that shaking is, and we can run it through our risk model in about tens of minutes and have some estimate of what the expected impacts would be to buildings and their occupants. Our focus is primarily on life safety and mass care because we expect that, you know, this is a model. It's not going to be a real indication of what's actually happening on the ground, but it's probably more useful than having no information at all. So we expect that probably it's only going to be good for about 48 to 72 hours after a major event before people would hopefully start to supplant this information with the ground truth or aerial reconnaissance data. We're planning to make it available at the neighborhood scale, so just to distinguish from tools like Pager or QLarm that are internationally available but quite broad in scale. Those are tools that are really designed for people who are outside of the disaster area and thinking about whether or not to send humanitarian aid or what response they're going to have. And we're really trying to focus on the needs of emergency managers and first responders within the disaster area. And so we're based on the feedback we've gotten from those end users, we're planning to deploy the Ready tool in three formats. One is a static text document similar to a tsunami alert. The second is a static dashboard that if we had a data limited situation and we're able to send maybe an email, but perhaps not able to load a website, then we could still deploy information that way. And finally, as a website or an interactive mapping tool, perhaps on the Earthquakes Canada website, or able to be pulled into local or regional emergency management dashboards through an API. So I'm going to show a couple of different prototypes that we've been working on and then outline our next steps. So this is an example of what the dynamic dashboard or the dynamic website might look like. This was from a modeling workshop that we did back in 2020 where we spoke to different emergency managers just to get a sense for, would this be a useful tool for you? Would you want us to pursue this further? And I think it was a loud yes. So you can see that we could have different layers. It's a GIS interface. We can overlay on top of that. For example, hospitals are what's shown in here. We've kind of refined this a little bit, but this is sort of a flavor for what it might look like. For the static text, this is, again, a prototype that we'll be showing tomorrow to our first municipality to get feedback on it. So you can see we have some information about the earthquake. We have a bit of information about the overall impacts of this event. And then in the bottom, we have some community-specific impacts where we're ranking communities by the impacts in terms of critical injuries and mass care. And again, that's because we want this to be actionable information. And so if they're trying to say, do I have the hospital capacity to meet the injured folks who are about to be coming in? Do I have enough first responders to go get people out of those buildings? Do I need to set up more mass care facilities than I was planning on? We hope that this could still answer those questions, even with the simple text document. The last one here is our static dashboard. So the idea is that this would be a multi-page PDF where the first page shown on the left is sort of the overall overview of the event, and the page on the right is a sample of a community page. So we would do one overview and then community pages for all the most heavily impacted communities. And so you can see that we have a bit of information in the top right corner about the event and some sense there of how impactful is this event going to be, and that we think is information that might be useful at a provincial, territorial, federal, or international level. And then we've got some maps there showing at the municipal scale what is the sort of injuries, displacements, and severely damaged buildings. We also have a table there showing the impacts with some estimate of the uncertainty, because of course in modeling, as we've talked about quite a bit in the last few days, we have a ton of uncertainty and we want to be able to convey that. And then again, we also have a little bit of a ranking there of which communities do we think are hardest hit. And I just keep re-emphasizing that because I think we saw in the November 2021 Atmospheric River event that there were some communities that, to my understanding, weren't heard from in the first few days. And it's not because they weren't impacted, it was because they were so impacted and so isolated that it was hard to get the message out. So we hope to empower provinces and territories to know which communities should you be hearing from, and if you haven't, maybe you can take a proactive approach. On the right-hand side, it's very similar what we're hoping to show for the community level, with the exception that now we're looking at showing our results at a neighborhood-specific scale. We're hoping to also, we're working on a project with the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure to test out including linear infrastructure, so thinking about damage to bridges that might disrupt transit or flow of supplies and aid within the area. We're also interested in whether or not communities could use a map of the social vulnerability of different neighborhoods within their municipality, because as again, I'm happy to see we've talked about so much, we know there are disproportionate impacts, and that should play into disaster management. So as I mentioned, we've been sort of generally working on this since 2020 with a big push in the last year and in the year to come. So we've done a great deal of stakeholder consultation, and right now we're working on prototype development, and then we'll go into prototype testing that starts, as I said, tomorrow, with a sort of a hope to start coming up with an operationalized version of this, and then some operational testing that could hopefully get us to a phase of making this available sometime in 2024, or sorry, by the end of fiscal 2024, so sometime in 2025 is the goal. And my contact information is there if anyone would like to reach out about this or the risk model. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Tegan and Henry. Yesterday, Paul Kovacs noted that in Canada, sometimes we forget about earthquakes because our losses have been 0, 0, 0, 0, but it might be 0, 0, 0, 60 billion. We in Canada have 3 different types of earthquakes. We have crustal earthquakes, we have deep crustal earthquakes on the interface of the Earth's crust and subducting slabs, and we have subduction zone earthquakes, where that's where we get the big megathrust earthquakes as large as magnitude 9. And just 10 days ago, it was the 324th anniversary of the last big one on the West Coast. But with that, we're lucky to hear today from Joe Horax about the experience of New Zealand in dealing with the Canterbury earthquake sequence in Christchurch that was obviously so disrupting, but provides a great example for Canada to learn from. So Joe, I turn it over to you. Thanks so much for being here virtually. You're coming to us from the future. It's February 8th.
Yeah, kia ora koutou. It's lovely to join you, and I'm just sorry that I can't be in there in person, but I hear it's pretty cold where you are, whereas it's summer here, so I will stay here for now, maybe visit in the summer. So I will just share my screen here. I've got some pictures to show you. Okay, hopefully that works.
Yes.
Marvelous. Right, just move this up here, technology. Right, so I'll just give you a very quick bit of context of where I'm coming from, what organisation I work for. So I work for a public insurer called Tokatu Ake EQC. That's EQC stands for the Earthquake Commission. We're shortly actually going to change to the Natural Hazard Commission because we do cover all sorts of natural hazards. So we are in part controlled by the New Zealand government. The government sets the levy or the premium and the risk financing strategy, but the rest is then at sort of an arm's length, and we have an independent board. In the private sector, that we then have obviously a range of private insurance providers, but we work very closely together. And in fact, we've got a partnership called the Natural Disaster Agreement. And this provides residential building cover for natural hazards and residential land cover for some natural hazards. The difference is the public insurer, we cover the first $300,000 of any damage, and then the private insurers cover above a cap of 300,000 any greater losses. What's possibly quite unique about EQC is that we've got a research risk reduction resilience function, so which actually is the part that I'm responsible for. I do all the non-insurance, non-claims part of it, which is what I like to tell all my friends and family, so I can't be responsible for your claims. But we are obviously aiming to reduce risk for the future. And that is because of a few key reasons. Firstly, obviously, we've got that financial exposure, that liability of all that first loss natural hazard damage. It also helps that we really understand and manage our risk well when it comes to securing reinsurance. When our levy pool and our reinsurance is exhausted, the liability goes back to the Crown, back to the government. So managing risk well is good for Crown risk exposure. And finally, because we're a public entity, we also have a function, a well-being, an interest in well-being, reducing harm of people and communities that perhaps a private insurer doesn't necessarily get that far into. So we've got a resilience strategy for natural hazard risk reduction that I'm responsible for. And our goal is essentially to influence the choice and decisions that people make about the built environment in New Zealand. And ultimately what we want to see is stronger homes built on better land. And you know, our experience tells us that that is really, really important for wider well-being and prosperity. Our basic MO, if you like, is that we invest in research, data and modelling. I've then got a team of people who try to operationalise that, translate it into forms that people can use, and then we try to get it into the hands of the people that can make a difference. So whether that's policymakers, planners, private sector practitioners and the public. So what we've obviously done a lot of research about the Canterbury earthquake sequence. That earthquake, the main earthquake in the sequence, is now 13 years ago. But as I'm going to show you, it's had such a significant effect on the whole national psyche, if you like, that we can't help but learn from it. We owe the people that lost their lives to learn from this earthquake and be better for the future. And it's particularly important because it's far from our only seismic risk. This was the location of the Canterbury earthquake sequence down here on our South Island, imaginatively named South Island. We then had another significant earthquake a few years later called the Kaikoura earthquake, much bigger earthquake, but less impact. These two, however, though, are not our biggest seismic risk. Our highest loss scenario is a Wellington earthquake, which is where I live. This is because it's our capital city. We've got lots of high-rise buildings, so that's considered our highest loss scenario. We've then got our most likely scenario, which is our alpine fault. That is, the probability on that is so high, it's 75% in the next 50 years. So, you know, it's completely irresponsible if we're not ready for an event like that. We've then got our maximum credible event on our subduction zone up here with a significant tsunami risk attached to it. It's very similar to the Tohoku earthquake scenario in Japan, reaching up to a magnitude of 9, and that is our planning basis. So that's our seismic risk. Although, like Canada, no part of the country is really free from seismic risk. Even up in the north or in the far south, there's some level of risk. There's not no risk. We then, of course, just add a few other things on. We've got a significant back arc volcanic system, so that provides a bit of alternative. And then, of course, like anywhere, the whole country has a bit of a storm flood landslide risk. But back to Christchurch. This was really the most severe test of New Zealand's disaster management arrangements since the 1930s. It was only a 6.3 magnitude earthquake, but for a few reasons, including that it was very shallow and it had some significant directionality to it. It had a very large peak ground acceleration of around 1.8 Gs in parts of the central city. That's certainly the highest ever recorded in New Zealand, and the highest ever in some of the highest in the whole world, I should say. A significant feature that had very significant horizontal and vertical ground movement. So it did cause a lot of damage to buildings. Here's what I think are probably some of the most sort of shocking pictures. They still are to me, despite having seen them so many times. This is the central CBD area of Christchurch City before the earthquake and then afterwards. That's the level of building loss you see there. And then a big part of the residential suburban areas of Christchurch before the earthquake and then afterwards. It's still 13 years later a very spooky place to drive around, to see these roads, but now no houses whatsoever. So a quick summary of the impacts to buildings, because this has been the thing that we really needed to sort out in the last 13 years. So unreinforced masonry was one of the biggest impacts, one of the biggest driver of deaths and injuries. 580 just fully collapsed, another 3,000 some partially collapsed or assessed as dangerous. Then a really shocking 1,240 multi-story buildings had to be demolished. Only 2 collapsed, which obviously caused a lot of the deaths. But that level of multi-story building demolition, because it was purely uneconomic to repair them. They stood up enough to allow people to escape and survive, but such an impact to have that level of loss afterwards, impact to recovery, I should say. And then, as you can see from those suburban pictures, 10,000 residential homes had to be demolished. So really significant building loss and, causing deaths and injuries. So these are some of the things we fixed up. We had very rapid legislation to require all unreinforced masonry to be secured, and that had rapid timeframes that had within a year or two that all unreinforced masonry had to be secured. We then had legislation requiring any building assessed as earthquake prone, which is defined as 33% of the current building code. They have longer timeframes, obviously, because that's more significant structural strengthening, but a lot of those deadlines are now coming up. And then finally, we are in the process of still some legislation on managed retreat, how we move from some of the high risk land, not just obviously not seismic, but with climate change that becomes quite pertinent. Taking the Canterbury earthquake sequence and the Kaikoura together, we've got a series of learnings, and I've just picked out that I won't go into any detail on. You can see some relate to buildings, some relate to land, and then general response and recovery learnings. It's fair to say that we haven't done badly in documenting these. This is just an absolute tiny drop in the ocean of some of the lessons learned reports, many of which had recommendations that we've been working on for these last 12 or 13 years. If you're interested in that, they are all stored in something called the Canterbury Earthquakes Digital Archive. That's the address here. That has got 153,000 separate items in it, including 90,000 articles, 60,000 images, and something like 2,000 digital recordings. So if you're looking for lessons, that's the place to be. I've now just got a bit of a more of a detailed look at what we've learned from our own data. We had 470,000 insurance claims just to us, so that's just residential building claims from the Canterbury earthquake sequence. So that is a really significant data set that it would be negligent of us not to learn as much as possible from. The first major lesson is around liquefaction. There was 400,000 tons of liquefaction material ejected in the Christchurch earthquake. Shaking alone accounted for something like 85% of the volume of claims, whereas 15% were liquefaction damage. But liquefaction damage caused 55% of the overall losses. So 15% of the claims, but 55% of the losses, versus shaking alone was 85% of the volume, 45% of the loss. So you can see that liquefaction is really causing the significant damage in these earthquakes. And that 470,000 claims really has provided us with some really, really detailed fragility curves. Now, this here on the left, you've got shaking intensity along the x-axis getting larger, and then the probability of building damage along the y-axis. So the average of all buildings, you can see the probability of failure escalating as you go up the shaking intensity. But if we look at buildings built post our modern building code, the situation's a little bit better. They last a little bit longer. And then modern buildings, the last significant update to our building code, are faring quite well. But the thing that is dragging it down, again, is those unreinforced masonry buildings. We've gone further than this, and we've actually started to break it down into some really detailed building attributes. So we can look at floor area, number of floors, construction type, foundation type, roof type. There's just a whole series of these, and we've got this for shaking alone, for liquefaction, for low-rise buildings, for high-rise buildings, for sloping land, for flat land. So we've got a lot of really detailed fragility models that we can put into our overall loss model. What we can then do with that, we've also worked on improving our hazard models, so we've got really good hazard models, including a measure of liquefaction susceptibility. We can then take our exposure, our building portfolio database, including continually trying to improve the amount of building attributes that we record. And we can apply those really detailed fragility curves, and we start to have a building damage ratio. That's what this looks like. So we get to this property level building damage. And then we can look at the amount of different buildings in these different categories and do a lot of different things with it. So I'm just going to very quickly, to finish up my presentation, go with some of these uses. The first is obviously for insurance for our loss modelling for the future. if we've got these very good hazard models now, very detailed fragility models, and improving all the time our exposure, our building database, we can apply it in some really specific ways. We can apply hazard, exposure, and fragility in very specific ways to get quite accurate loss models, quite accurate predictions of where damage is going to occur. Secondly, we've started to use this to aggregate. We do a run of the loss model immediately after an event, and we can predict where the highest response and recovery needs are going to be, where we need to send insurance assessors, where we need to do to prioritize impact assessment, where we need to prioritize welfare, that sort of thing. The third thing is we use this as evidence to try to influence central government policy, particularly around building regulation, but increasingly around resource management, which is land use allocation. We also do this at the local government level. So any statutory plan that's produced at a local government level, we collate all this evidence and we submit on their plan. So for example, using that last example that I gave, the relevant local authority there, which is Hutt Valley, we send them that and say, do not under any circumstances intensify here. There's a big push to intensify, densify in New Zealand at the moment because we have a bit of a housing shortage. But our message is, let's do it in the right places. Don't do it in a liquefaction prone area. Don't do it where our models show that you're getting highest damage. Or if you have to, make sure you use the right foundations. Fifthly, we try to influence private sector practice, both their awareness of hazard risk and their use of resilience-focused methodologies. So here's some planning and engineering guidance on how to the right foundations for liquefaction-prone land. Finally, we've got this public education function where we try to raise awareness of hazards and preparedness of the public, including some quite detailed property risk reduction measures that people can take. So that's basically our program there, loss modelling for insurance, response recovery, influencing central government policy, local government planning, private sector practice, and public safety, if you like. So that's my roundup. In New Zealand, we have this proverb saying ka mua ka muri, which means walking backwards into the future, which I always quite like. And I like to think of our evidence base as the past, if you like, trying to improve the future, taking our ancestors into the future, taking those lessons, the people didn't lose their lives in vain and we did nothing different. We're trying to improve for the future. So that is our foundation from which we stand strong. Kia ora.
Thank you so much, Joe. I really love that proverb at the end, and I'm wondering if for our sake you can elaborate on that, because I think in Canada we're very much similar to New Zealand before the Canterbury sequence. We have a similar building stock, similar hazards that our country in general is exposed to, similar building code. So, if you could go back and help us through your experience, acknowledging too that this room is largely full of insurance sector professionals, what advice would you provide if we can walk backwards and learn from your experience?
Gosh, so one of the biggest features, or the thing that I think shocked the nation, was that a disaster like this touches every single part of society. It's not just about emergency management or insurance, it's about transport and access. So there's lessons for everybody. Every single part of society should be learning something from events like this or taking some sort of preparedness actions in their business or in their everyday lives. Gosh, it's hard to pick a few. I certainly advocate for insurance companies to do as much as they can to push into physical resilience. Certainly private insurers in this country, private insurers have always been lobbyists for risk reduction, but not actually getting into taking action themselves. So we are trying to work closely together on a resilience program that is, goes a little bit beyond it just encouraging people to take risk reduction action. So we're going to see local authorities making sure that land use planning is shutting.
Oh no. I think we've, oh, you're back, Joe. You were talking about land use.
Yeah. Land use planning is so important, both shutting the door on any future risk that we're building into our building stock, but also then going back and looking at our existing building stock and fixing up, strengthening where we can. Certainly, buildings are the things that kill people, so that's where we've really focused on where we build and how we build. But there's big lessons for infrastructure, obviously. Those earthquakes have really shown that our water networks are not that great. We have big lessons for access and transport. How do we get into these remote communities? And you've already spoken a little bit about that. Certainly, we've had that experience with some big storms we had last year as well. Gosh, there's just so many. As I said, that our digital archive has got 150,000 records in it, so there's lessons on everything, to be honest.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks. I want to give folks the opportunity to pose questions to the panel too, and I think it's a real goldmine to have Joel on the line. But first, I'd like to just ask each of you what you see as key messages to the folks you're talking to. So I think we have different stakeholder groups, but in terms of the key messages that you're delivering, who is it to and what is that message? And Joe, one thing you mentioned, if you could focus on that homeowner group, I think that would be great for this audience. Sure. But if you want to pick an audience and the message you're providing, each of you, that would be great. Go for it, Henry, sure.
Sure, I'll start. As an insurance conference...
Your mic on?
I don't think my mic's on.
Oh,
Oh, that's better. Thank you. As an insurance audience, I think the opportunities here in the next years are seeing your clients adopt earthquake early warning technologies to protect their infrastructure. I'm not an expert in building or transportation, but in the scenarios that I showed of potential protective actions, if your clients were to adopt some of these things in the context of earthquake early warning, there are possibilities for the reduction of losses when that major earthquake comes.
Thanks, Deegan.
Yeah, I guess maybe instead of I guess to an insurance audience, I think we've talked about model transparency a lot, and that's one thing that in our model, it's all open source. So in as much as it's possible, if there are other modelers in the room who are interested in sort of, we always love the opportunity to know if what we're doing is in line with what other modelers are doing. So certainly, feel free to reach out if that's something that's of interest. In terms of maybe more the disaster management or humanitarian side of the folks who may be in the room, for specifically the rapid earthquake damage estimation ready tool, it's really important to us that we want this to be actionable. And I think even with the risk model, we want our information to be actionable by people. And in order to do that, we need to hear from people. So we tried really hard to seek out different user groups. But if you see yourself as someone who's a user group, or a user or a potential user or an interested party, please feel free to get in touch. Because, yeah, I think I went into this field thinking if we just knew more about geophysics, then we could solve the problems. And you really see more and more that it might not be a knowledge gap. It could be a lot of other gaps. And so maybe as I always try to encourage among scientists that we need to understand what the stakeholders need to have instead of running off in the direction we want to do our science in and then hoping it works for them.
Thanks. Yeah, Joe.
So one of the things that we've really been pushing is trying to push the boundary on public risk information. So I really agree with what you've all been saying. It's a touchy subject, but people are very concerned, rightly so, about house prices. It's their biggest capital investment, so they don't necessarily want you to point out that there's this area X is a high risk zone. But that's continually what we're trying to do, because apart from anything else, that awareness fades rapidly after a big event. Even something like Canterbury that had such an impact that, you know, the behaviours change, the awareness changes. So one of the biggest revelations for us over the last few years is that our own claims data is an absolute gold mine of information. And last year we launched what we call the Natural Hazards Portal, which is where we have made public all our claims data going back to the 90s. So it's just the basics of, there was a claim here for earthquake, landslide, flooding, or whatever, the date. But it just provides that awareness that some sort of impact has taken place. If you're buying that house, you might want to check it out, see what's happened in the past. Has everything been fixed up that need to be? And consider it in your future decision making. So again, we're just trying to push this awareness of natural hazard risk generally. But I think it's really, really important that the more information we can get out there, the better. And I really encourage insurers to think about what they're prepared to be public, or what they can make public, and how they can use it to raise awareness, whether that's with the public or with a local or central government or federal government, to make your point about risk reduction and resilience.
Thanks very much. Do we have any questions in the crowd? There's a mic coming.
Thanks very much. I'm wondering if any of you can comment on the rather controversial subject of an earthquake forecasting. There is a number of outfits out there around the world that claim to have such prowess with various degrees of temporal and spatial accuracy, as distinct from early warning, which is effectively a sure thing coming your way. What are your thoughts on earthquake forecasting, please?
Do you want to take that?
Yeah, I'm happy to. As a seismologist, unequivocally, we cannot predict earthquakes. So, sometimes the term prediction and forecasting can get a little bit muddled together. In terms of predicting an earthquake that's going to happen in the future, that's a no. We don't do that. We can't do that. It's actually, we're not sure as a seismological community if it's fundamentally possible in the future. And then in terms of earthquake forecasting, which in our community we use to mean some quantitative estimate of the change in probability of an earthquake of a certain size or larger. It's accompanied by a location and a timeline, and generally I see it used in aftershock. So, you have some large event, and now you can, based on that large event, based on earthquake productivity in that region and elsewhere in the world, you can make an estimate of how much has the probability of subsequent earthquakes changed. I think they're doing a lot of great research at the USGS, for example, about can decision makers like first responders and emergency managers use that information. For example, if people are going into homes after an event, and they're worried about the structural stability of that home, then is it safe for them to go in if the risk of aftershock is quite high? But I think it's a difficult thing to manage the messaging, because you might be going from a low probability of a subsequent damaging event to a still low but slightly higher probability. But you could also say maybe the probability has gone up 300 times, and that, like, the two different ways of messaging that might lead someone to a really different outcome. So it's a bit of a quagmire.
Thanks. And I think we've got time for just a question from Paul.
Try to keep it short. Thank you. Thanks to each of you for outstanding presentations, and again for remarkable work over a long period of time. So thank you. With your national responsibility in Canada, you are working in a country where there's very different perspective on earthquake risk in the eastern part of the country and the west. And you're providing advice and tools that can be used in all parts of the country. Any special comments or advice you want to share about how some of your tools are being used and understood and applied in the West, and how we may make more progress in other parts of Canada where this risk doesn't seem to be seen as acutely?
Thanks, Paul. Great question. I think through our work, we certainly hope to increase that awareness, particularly in Quebec and the Ottawa-St. Lawrence corridor. But I'll turn to Henry and then Tegan to answer that too.
So you touch on a very actual subject. We do see a very significant ignorance on the part of people in Eastern Canada. They don't believe in earthquakes. So some people don't believe in climate change, some people don't believe in earthquakes. Part of the introduction of the earthquake early warning system is a public messaging campaign. This is about to get underway in British Columbia. We're kind of preaching to the converted there. But it becomes part of our messaging in later in this year as the system for Eastern Canada comes online to get that message out there. What impact that will have, it's hard to say. Our American colleagues told us that the vast majority of the people learned of the existence of an earthquake early warning system when the first alert came through. So we have to be realistic about public education. So small earthquakes that are not too damaging are probably the best way of informing people of the nature of earthquake risk and for the potential of the earthquake early warning system as it comes online.
Yeah. I think some of the things we've seen in Western Canada, at least through our work, we sometimes get involved with municipalities that are hoping to do risk reduction, and so we can use our model to help them make a case for why they should receive maybe federal or provincial funding for whatever mitigation activity they're hoping to do. So maybe I think that's something where we can see a concrete action being taken. But when we try, maybe some efforts that we've had to try to engage in Eastern Canada, this is very subjective, but I get the sense that there's a feeling that it's lower priority and maybe, there's not as much appetite for some of those projects. So perhaps that's something that changes. I think, frankly, things like the Earthquake Early Warning Network could be so useful because now there will be greater public awareness and funding put into raising that awareness. I think it's interesting to there's sort of a different cultural landscape, I think, too, about thinking about earthquakes. And maybe one of the positives is that I think in Western Canada, I often encounter a sense of nihilism that, it doesn't matter what we do because we're all going to fall into the sea or something, which is not how it happens, of course. And so maybe in the East, you're not starting from that same difficult starting point to overcome. So.
One other remark on that occurs to me is turning the question around. Earthquake early warning has the potential for reducing cash losses to your industry. How can you leverage your contacts with the public and with property owners and equipment owners to get that message out? There's a limited amount governments can do here. Governments advertise all the time. How much impact does that actually have? But if there's something that actually affects people financially directly and they can see the potential for saving themselves money, then perhaps there's some more motivation there.
And in terms of behavior change...
Sorry.
Sorry. In terms of behavior change, too, it's cultural, I think.
Yeah.
And in BC, once you get the ball rolling, and if you look at sociology, it is peer pressure that actually raises awareness and instigates behavior change. And if your neighbor tells you they have an earthquake kit and they know what they're doing when the big one happens, you're more likely to do that too. And we have that in BC. We have momentum, but that may lack in Eastern Canada, so we need to start that. So I challenge you to, if you live in Eastern Canada in an earthquake-prone zone, get a kit and tell your friends.
So I do.
Did Joe?
I was just going to jump in and say that as a warning for you guys, that Christchurch was considered low to moderate earthquake risk before the earthquake.
Yeah.
On that ominous note, I'm afraid I have to jump in. I could listen to this all afternoon, and I would, but then eventually somebody would probably get mad at me. And I'm sure everybody is eager to move on with their day if you're coming down to the end of CatIQ Connect, but I am so very happy that we could have Joe join us from early tomorrow morning. Don't tell us what happens. We want to be surprised. And to have Tegan, Henry, and Malika here on stage was really great to hear what we're working on here in Canada, as well as what we can learn from the wealth of experience, hard-earned experience from what's happened before in New Zealand. And I should quote Jim Abraham from earlier, I'm definitely going to have a lot of homework digging into all of those lessons learned libraries that New Zealand has produced. So if you would all like to join me in giving our panel a great hand.